Okay, good evening. Welcome to tonight's Shiur. The Halacha Shiur is we're continuing our discussion about Shidduchim, and tonight's focus is about the very important matter regarding telling information, Shidduch information, what's allowed to say, what's not allowed to say, what one has to say, and I want to preface it with two comments. The first comment is that none of this is going to be halacha l'maisa. If anyone has recourse to to respond to questions or to seek information, one should obviously ask their own rav, their own posek. It's a very, very complicated area, and the stakes are very high. And therefore, this is just general comments about this topic. That's Hakdama number one. Hakdama number two, I came across, since the Petira of Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal, a couple of weeks ago, we're still in the Shloshim, I came across, of course, there's been a huge amount written, and it's just impossible to absorb it all, the greatness of the person. But one story regarding Shidduchim stands out, and I thought I would just mention this story as an intro for this evening. An amazing story. There was a fellow who unfortunately had a very bad scar on his face, and he was obviously very conscious about this scar, and he was in the parsha of Shidduchim, and he found it very difficult. And even if he did go off the ground and he met potential partners, unfortunately it didn't seem to proceed after the first date. I suppose people were very concerned about his scar, and he was very distraught about it. And after a while he decided he's going to speak to Reb Chaim Kanievsky to get some advice. And he went into the holy room, and he sat there with Reb Chaim, and he just burst out crying. All his emotions came to the fore, and he just burst out crying, and he explained to Reb Chaim how difficult it was for him. He'd been on many dates, nothing had succeeded, and he put it down to the fact that he had a scar. Reb Chaim looked at him and said, "Why don't you just tell her why you got the scar? Why you got the scar?" So the guy explained, he goes, "But it's awkward. If I were to initiate this, I don't want to start, highlighting it. I wanted to get to know me, not this particular story." Reb Chaim said to him, "When the next date you go on, just tell the girl at the outset, at the very beginning, explain to her before you start all the pleasantries. Just explain to her how you came about to get this scar." And sure enough, that's exactly what he did. He went on the next date. He sat down with the girl and explained to her the story. The story was that one time, many years earlier, he was walking in the streets of Jerusalem, and he saw an Arab running after this young girl, and he feared for this girl, and he ran after the Arab and the girl, and he managed to divert her, and the Arab turned his attention to him, and the girl managed to escape. But he took out a knife and he lashed out at him, and he was very seriously wounded, and he lashed out at this guy, and it gave him this terrible scar. As he was telling this girl the story, she suddenly started to blush and started to well up, and she said, "I was that girl. I was that girl. I've been looking everywhere, and I was trying to find who was the person who was my savior, who was the person who came to my rescue." And of course, it turned out it was this young man, and she thanked him. She's been looking all the years to thank and to meet this person, to thank him in person, and sure enough, sometime later they get engaged, and he realized what Reb Chaim, the wise advice that he received from Reb Chaim. It's an amazing story, just as we begin this discussion about the third installment of Shidduchim, Shidduch information. So here we go. Let's discuss Shidduch information. Here we go. So the first, we have to differentiate between different types of information. The first information is regarding serious matters. Now, how do you define serious matters? Well, serious matters could be physical or mental illness. It could be lack of religious observance. It could be infertility, something along that level of gravity. And the halacha is that if you're asked about it, then it's prohibited to withhold or give false information. And in certain situations, if false information is given, it could invalidate the marriage. And therefore the stakes are very high. And if a person is worried, what about Lashon Hara in these situations? Let me share with you an amazing insight of Reb Chaim Volozhin. I've got it on the sheet. If you want the sheet, email me please at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. But there's an amazing idea quoted in the Sefer Chochma Umusa. This is the Alter from Kelm. In Maimah Kuf Pei Aleph, he says the following amazing idea. The pasuk says, "Lo seilech rochel ba'amecha, lo sa'amud al dam re'echa." It's a pasuk in Pashas Kedoshim. Lo seilech rochel ba'amecha, lo sa'amud al dam re'echa ani Hashem. It's the same pasuk. Says the Alter from Kelm. Shamaiti b'shem Hagon Reb Chaim Volozhin. I heard the following idea from in the name of Reb Chaim Volozhin. It says, "Lo seilech rochel ba'amecha, lo sa'amud al dam re'echa." Don't go tale-bearing, and don't stand by your brother's blood whilst it's being spilled. Says the Reb Chaim Volozhin, "B'makom sheyesh l'sapeh lashon hara." In a situation where you have to tell what seems to be like lashon hara, hanimna milasapeh. If someone refrains, he holds back from telling this information. Over lo samud adam re'echa. You violate the law of don't stand by idly whilst your brother's blood is being spilled. An amazing explanation of the juxtaposition of these two phrases. Lo seilech rochel ba'amecha, lo samed adam re'echa. If you hold back from giving information when you need to, then you're over lo samed adam re'echa. Now, even when it is permitted to reveal information, there are certain conditions, and let's go through a few of them. Number one, it's proper knowledge and it's not speculative. It's easy to do this. One can jump to conclusions, one can guess, one can speculate, but it has to be real first-hand knowledge. That's number one. Number two, you cannot magnify the severity of the illness or of the danger involved. Number three, it cannot be personal. The intention must be to protect the prospective spouse from difficulty, from pain, but it cannot be personal, any form of vendetta. You never like that person, you feel an obligation to do it, whatever it may be. It has to be that it's not personal, it's just the intention is just to save the prospective spouse from pain. And number four, one has to know that the advice will be taken seriously, because sometimes there are cases where you feel that you want to tell this information, but they just won't take it seriously, or they will ignore it, or whatever the case may be. And therefore you have to fulfill all of these conditions. But when it comes to serious matters, for example, serious physical or mental illness, lack of religious observance, infertility is another example, then it's prohibited to withhold or to give false information. And as I say, in some cases it could actually invalidate the marriage. Now, there are, of course, less serious matters. For example, minor illnesses. For example, minor blemishes in the lineage, in the yichus of the person. There may be some sort of relative who is not religious, who is not Jewish even, who knows what. But these are less serious matters because they're not the immediate family, or the illness is relatively minor. How do you deal with that? So in that situation, you don't have to divulge deficiencies which most people do not consider an impediment. So for example, a person has got an ingrowing toenail. That's a silly example, but a person's got an ingrowing toenail. That's not an impediment, so you don't have to divulge that information. Something which is a minor, insignificant illness, you don't have to worry about, and you don't have to divulge that information. Now, the trouble is, it's very often difficult to gauge what is considered, what people consider an impediment or not, and it's very subjective. And for some people, this could be more serious than the way you treat it. So it very much depends, it's very subjective, and therefore one should really consult a Rav, someone who knows the situation, the people involved. Again, if you are divulging detrimental information, then, like I said before, it needs proper intention. It cannot be speculative. It can't be just that you've got some sort of vendetta against this person. It needs to be for the proper intentions. It needs to be that you cannot magnify the severity of the particular situation. And again, you know that the situation will be taken seriously. So we differentiate between these categories of what's serious, what's less serious. But generally speaking, serious matters, like I just mentioned, then it's prohibited to withhold or to give false information. But information which is of less of a serious nature, then minor illnesses, minor blemishes, etc., then you don't have to divulge that information. However, so long as most people do not consider that an impediment in any way. What we're going to discuss next week, and I recognize it's a big topic and there's lots of details and nuances and but it's not really. It's very difficult to cover it in a very short halacha slot. But please God, next week what we're going to be focusing on is a fascinating. It's not next week actually. It's after Pesach. We'll break Mitzvah Hashem for Pesach, and then the week after Pesach we'll go back and we'll discuss some interesting cases about Shidduchim, some real life cases that we'll turn our attention to. Okay, we'll leave the Shidduchim slot there.